A quiet rebellion. The town of Meadowbrook had always been a place where life moved at a measured pace, and traditions were held tightly, like a child clutching a cherished blanket. The streets were lined with pastel houses, their porches adorned with rocking chairs that creaked under the weight of time. Gossip flowed freely, carried on the crisp air like dandelion seeds, and every deviation from the norm was scrutinized with unrelenting precision. Abigail Whitmore was no stranger to the watchful eyes of Meadowbrook. At 32, she was a spirited woman with an indomitable will, and a heart that had long refused to conform to the narrow boundaries imposed by her neighbors. Widowed young and left with a modest inheritance from her late husband, she had chosen to remain in the town, despite its cloying judgment, for reasons she could never quite articulate. Perhaps it was a quiet rebellion against the notion that her life should follow the same monotonous rhythm as everyone else's. Her decision to adopt had not been made lightly. It was born out of years of volunteering at a city orphanage, where she had spent weekends reading to children whose laughter brightened her otherwise predictable life. On a rainy afternoon, she met Lucas, a 10-month-old boy with deep brown eyes and an infectious giggle. His chubby fingers clutched hers as if he had always known her, and in that moment, Abigail knew she was destined to be his mother. The process had been grueling, filled with paperwork, interviews, and more than one skeptical glance from social workers who questioned her motives. But Abigail's determination had not wavered. When she finally brought Lucas home, she held him close, her heart swelling with love as she whispered, "We're a team now, little one." Meadowbrook, however, was not so welcoming. Abigail's neighbors greeted the news with shock thinly veiled by polite smiles. The sight of Lucas's dark skin in the arms of a white woman was a scandal that ignited a firestorm of gossip. "Did you hear what Abigail did?" Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed moral compass, asked her bridge club one Tuesday. "She's brought home a colored baby. Can you imagine? What will people think?" The whispers turned to pointed stares and hushed conversations whenever Abigail strolled through town with Lucas. At the grocery store, cashiers avoided making small talk, and customers pretended not to see her. On Sunday mornings, her pew at church became conspicuously empty as people chose seats further away. Even Pastor Simmons, a man who often preached about kindness and acceptance, seemed awkward when delivering his sermon. Abigail bore it all with a quiet strength, her love for Lucas acting as an impenetrable shield. At night, she sang lullabies to him, her voice trembling only slightly as she promised him a future brighter than the prejudice they faced. "You're my son," she whispered, brushing a curl from his forehead, "and I will fight for you with every ounce of my being." As Lucas grew, the challenges became more pronounced. By the time he was 5, he began noticing the way people treated them differently. Children at the playground would run to their mothers when he approached, their wary eyes reflecting the biases of their upbringing. Lucas would tug on Abigail's hand and ask, "Why don't they like me, Mom?" Abigail knelt before him, her hands framing his cherubic face. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand," she explained, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "But you are brave, kind, and wonderful. And someday, they'll see that too." Lucas nodded, his innocent trust in her unwavering. "Okay, Mom. I'll be kind." When Lucas started school, the prejudice became more overt. Teachers praised his intelligence, but often dismissed his accomplishments as unexpected. At recess, he sat alone while other children whispered behind cupped hands. Abigail watched from afar, her heart breaking as Lucas navigated a world that seemed determined to remind him he was different. One afternoon, he came home with a tear in his shirt and a bruise on his cheek. Abigail's protective instincts flared as she demanded to know what had happened. "Tommy pushed me," Lucas mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He said I don't belong here." Abigail's hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wrapped Lucas in a hug, her voice firm but gentle. "Listen to me, Lucas. You belong wherever you choose to be. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The next day, Abigail marched into the principal's office, her resolve as fierce as a storm. "I won't have my son treated this way," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You have a responsibility to protect every child in this school." The principal, a man with a receding hairline and a penchant for avoiding confrontation, nodded mutely, promising to address the issue. But Abigail knew that real change wouldn't come from a single meeting. It would take years of persistence, of proving that Lucas deserved the same respect as any other child. As time went on, Lucas began to shine in ways that even the most skeptical townsfolk couldn't ignore. By the age of 10, he was reading at a high school level, his curiosity boundless and his intelligence undeniable. Abigail encouraged his interests, taking him to the city library every weekend to borrow books about science, history, and medicine. One day, Lucas looked up from a book about the human body, his eyes alight with excitement. "Mom, I think I'd want to be a doctor." Abigail beamed, her heart swelling with pride. "You'd make a wonderful doctor, sweetheart. You have a kind heart and a brilliant mind." From that moment, Lucas's dream became his guiding star. He worked tirelessly, excelling in every subject and winning accolades that began to shift the town's perception of him. Teachers who had once underestimated him now marveled at his potential. But the whispers of prejudice never fully disappeared, and Abigail knew they might always linger like a shadow. One evening, as Abigail and Lucas sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, he asked, "Do you think the town will ever really accept us?" Abigail reached for his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Acceptance isn't something you wait for, Lucas. It's something you earn by staying true to who you are. Keep working hard, and the right people will see your worth." Lucas nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. "I'll make you proud, Mom." Abigail smiled, her heart aching with love and hope. "You already do." But the road ahead would test them in ways neither could have foreseen. The town of Meadowbrook, so set in its ways, was about to face a reckoning, one that would force its people to confront the very prejudices that had defined their lives for so long. And Lucas, the boy they had once dismissed, would stand at the center of it all. A community divided. By the time Lucas turned 12, his quiet resilience had begun to fracture Meadowbrook's once unified disapproval. The boy who had been the subject of hushed whispers was now gaining quiet admiration, though few dared admit it. His academic prowess made him a standout, not just in his grade, but in the entire school district. Teachers could no longer deny his brilliance, and parents found themselves grudgingly referencing Lucas in conversations with their children. "Why can't you study more like Lucas?" Mrs. Henderson scolded her son after another disappointing report card. The same Mrs. Henderson who had once muttered, "What was Abigail thinking?" while passing Abigail and Lucas on the street. Despite the undercurrents of reluctant acknowledgement, overt acceptance remained scarce. The town still clung tightly to its prejudices, treating Lucas and Abigail as an exception to their unspoken rule rather than as equals. For Lucas, the contrast between admiration and rejection became a defining feature of his adolescence. On an unseasonably warm fall afternoon, Meadowbrook Elementary hosted its annual science fair. The gymnasium buzzed with activity as students displayed their projects, baking soda volcanoes, solar system dioramas, and makeshift windmills. Lucas stood proudly beside his project, a working model of a water filtration system designed to clean contaminated water using basic materials. "Why don't you try it?" he encouraged a group of curious classmates, pointing to a jug of muddy water. The children hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, a girl named Annie, finally stepped forward, pouring the dirty water into the system. Within moments, clear water trickled out of the spout. "That's amazing," Annie exclaimed, her face lighting up. A few other kids crowded around, suddenly eager to test it themselves. Lucas beamed, their excitement validating his hard work. Not everyone shared their enthusiasm. From across the room, Tommy, the same boy who had pushed Lucas years earlier, watched with narrowed eyes. "It's just a stupid filter," he muttered to his friends. That he didn't even make it himself. Lucas overheard but refused to let the comment dampen his pride. He knew better than to react. Abigail had taught him that rising above cruelty was its own form of triumph. Still, the word stung, a reminder that no achievement could fully shield him from prejudice. When the winners were announced, Lucas stood on the makeshift stage, clutching a blue ribbon. His mother clapped enthusiastically from the audience, her pride uncontainable. But as Lucas scanned the room, he noticed the divided expressions. Some clapped politely, their faces betraying their reluctance. Others, like Tommy's parents, crossed their arms and whispered among themselves. Later that evening, Abigail found Lucas sitting on the porch, staring at the ribbon in his hands. "You should be proud," she said, sitting beside him. "You earned that." "I am," Lucas replied softly. "But why do I feel like some people don't want me to be proud?" Abigail sighed, her heart aching for her son. "Because, Lucas, sometimes people can't see past their own fears and biases, but you can't let their small minds keep you from dreaming big." Lucas nodded, his determination solidifying. "I'll work harder, Mom. Someday they won't have a choice but to see me for who I really am." In the years that followed, Lucas's dedication grew even more relentless. He joined the debate team, won spelling bees, and excelled in science competitions. The accolades piled up, but so did the tension. Meadowbrook was a town where success was tolerated only when it didn't disrupt the status quo, and Lucas's achievements were a constant reminder of what the town preferred to ignore. Even so, a few began to see Lucas differently. Mrs. Willow, the school's science teacher, became one of his earliest allies. A stoic woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, she recognized Lucas's potential and went out of her way to nurture it. "Have you ever considered a career in medicine?" she asked him one day after class. Lucas's face lit up. "Actually, I have. I want to be a doctor." Mrs. Willow nodded approvingly. "Good. The world needs doctors like you. Smart, compassionate, and unafraid to work hard." Her encouragement meant the world to Lucas. For once, someone outside his home believed in him without reservation. As Lucas transitioned into high school, his reputation continued to grow, both as a gifted student and as a young man of unshakable character. But with success came new challenges. The town's high school was larger and more diverse, drawing students from neighboring communities. While this expanded Lucas's circle of friends, it also introduced new forms of bias. One day in the cafeteria, Lucas overheard a group of students mocking his ambition. "He thinks he's going to be a doctor," one sneered. "Bet he'll be lucky to get out of this town." Lucas clenched his jaw but didn't respond. Instead, he channeled his anger into action, spending late nights studying and volunteering at a nearby hospital to gain experience. Abigail, as always, was his unwavering cheerleader, packing him lunches for his hospital shifts and staying up late to quiz him on biology terms. "You're going to be amazing," she told him after he aced his first anatomy test. "I just know it." Despite his growing list of accomplishments, Lucas couldn't escape the reality of Meadowbrook's lingering prejudice. He noticed it in the way adults spoke to him, always polite, but rarely warm. He saw it in the way other kids avoided sitting next to him on the bus or inviting him to parties. Even at church, where sermons about love and acceptance were preached weekly, the stares never fully disappeared. Abigail's support remained his anchor. On nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable, she reminded him of his worth. "You're not just strong, Lucas," she said. "You're extraordinary, and extraordinary people often face extraordinary challenges." Her words fueled him, even as the obstacles grew more daunting. By the time he graduated high school as valedictorian, Lucas had earned a full scholarship to a prestigious medical school. The announcement was met with a mixture of admiration and envy. "Good for him," some murmured. "He's getting out of here." But others were less gracious. "He won't last a year. Tommy's father scoffed at the local diner. "Mark my words, people like him don't belong in places like that." Abigail overheard the comment as she refilled coffee cups, her hands trembling with suppressed anger. But she said nothing. Instead, she focused on Lucas's upcoming departure, determined to send him off with all the love and encouragement she could muster. The night before Lucas left for medical school, Abigail cooked his favorite meal, fried chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans. They sat at the table, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Abigail broke the quiet. "You've always made me proud, Lucas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But what you're about to do, it's more than I ever dreamed." Lucas reached for her hand. "I wouldn't be here without you, Mom. Everything I am is because of you." They spent the evening reminiscing, laughing over childhood memories, and sharing hopes for the future. But as Lucas packed his bags later that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving Meadowbrook was only the beginning of his journey. The next morning, as the bus pulled away, Abigail stood on the curb, waving until it disappeared from view. Her heart ached with both pride and loneliness, knowing her son was heading toward a brighter future, even if it meant leaving her behind. Meadowbrook, however, wasn't ready to forget Lucas Whitmore. His absence would soon leave a void that the town, in its stubbornness, could never have anticipated. And when the time came, they would need him more than they ever imagined. The first test. Abigail returned to the quiet of her home after seeing Lucas off, her steps heavier than usual. The house felt emptier, each room echoing with memories of Lucas growing up. She busied herself with chores, but her mind often drifted to her son. Was he settling in? Was he eating well? Would he find people who appreciated him for who he was? Meanwhile, Lucas arrived at the sprawling campus of Crestview Medical School, a world away from Meadowbrook. The university brimmed with diversity, students from all over the world bustling across the grounds, each carrying dreams as big as his own. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt an unfamiliar sense of belonging. No one here whispered about him or looked at him with suspicion. Here, he was simply another aspiring doctor. But the challenges were immense. The coursework was grueling and the competition fierce. Lucas often found himself staying up late, poring over anatomy textbooks and case studies. He made friends. Sarah, a sharp-witted pre-med student from Chicago, and Raj, a soft-spoken aspiring surgeon from India. Together, they formed a study group, pushing each other to excel while sharing late-night laughs over pizza and coffee. "Lucas, you've got the focus of a monk," Raj joked during one of their study sessions. "If anyone here's going to graduate at the top of the class, it's you." Lucas grinned, but his mind often wandered back to Meadowbrook. He wanted to prove to his hometown, not for validation, but for his mother, that he was worth the sacrifices she'd made. He called Abigail every Sunday evening, recounting his week in detail and asking about life back home. "It's the same old Meadowbrook," Abigail would say, her voice tinged with both affection and weariness. "But I tell everyone how proud I am of you." Back in Meadowbrook, Abigail faced her own challenges. Without Lucas, the stares and whispers seemed sharper, the town's judgment less diluted. Some neighbors even commented on her son's departure, their words dripping with false concern. "He's in the big city now," Mrs. Henderson said one morning at the diner where Abigail worked. "Bet he won't come back." "Can't say I blame him." Abigail kept her composure, offering a tight smile as she refilled Mrs. Henderson's coffee. But each comment stung, a reminder that Meadowbrook's narrow-mindedness might never change. Despite this, she found solace in Lucas's letters and phone calls, treasuring every word as a lifeline to the hope he carried. Months turned into years, and Lucas's time at Crestview flew by. His professors began to notice his dedication and sharp mind. During a particularly challenging rotation in the emergency room, Dr. Evans, a seasoned physician, pulled Lucas aside. "You've got something special, Whitmore," Dr. Evans said, his gruff voice tinged with respect. "Not just the brains, but the heart. Don't lose that. It's what makes the best doctors. Lucas carried those words with him, a source of strength during long nights and tough exams. Yet he never forgot Meadowbrook. While many of his peers planned careers in prestigious hospitals, Lucas's dream remained steadfast. He wanted to return to his hometown and open a clinic. One evening, while walking across campus, Lucas confided in Sarah and Raj. "I know it sounds crazy," he began, "but I want to go back to Meadowbrook. They need a doctor, even if they don't know it yet." Sarah frowned. "After everything you told us about that place, why go back when you could work anywhere?" "Because it's home," Lucas replied simply. "And my mom's there. I want to make a difference where it matters most." Raj nodded thoughtfully. "It's not crazy, Lucas. It's brave. And you're the kind of person who can do it." By the time Lucas graduated, Abigail had planned a celebration for him in Meadowbrook. She decorated the house with streamers and balloons, baking his favorite chocolate cake. The day Lucas arrived, wearing his crisp graduation gown and clutching his medical degree, Abigail couldn't contain her tears. "You've done it," she said, her voice trembling as she hugged him. "I always knew you would." Lucas smiled, holding her close. "It's because of you, Mom. I wouldn't be here without you." Despite the joy of his homecoming, Lucas knew Meadowbrook would be a tough audience. He spent months preparing his clinic, transforming an old storefront into a welcoming space equipped with modern medical tools. A bright sign above the door read, "Meadowbrook Health Clinic, Dr. Lucas Whitmore." The day the clinic opened, Lucas and Abigail stood together, cutting the ceremonial ribbon. A few townspeople showed up, mostly out of curiosity, but the whispers began almost immediately. "Can you believe he came back?" One man muttered. "Bet he won't last long," another said. Lucas ignored the chatter, focusing instead on the patients who trickled in. At first it was just a few, those too desperate to travel to the city hospital or too curious to stay away. Lucas treated each one with the same care and respect, no matter their history with him or his mother. Over time, however, the trickle slowed. Word spread that some residents preferred to travel hours to the nearest city rather than trust the local newcomer doctor. Lucas spent long days waiting for patients who never came, the emptiness of the clinic a sharp contrast to his bustling days in medical school. One afternoon, as Lucas sat reviewing patient charts, Abigail walked in with a tray of sandwiches. "You've got to eat," she said, placing the tray on his desk. Lucas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mom, what if I made the wrong choice? What if Meadowbrook never accepts me?" Abigail sat across from him, her gaze steady. "You didn't come back for their acceptance, Lucas. You came back to make a difference. And you will. Give it time." Lucas nodded, her words a balm to his fraying resolve. But deep down, he couldn't shake the fear that Meadowbrook would never see him for who he truly was. Lucas's fears would soon be put to the test. One evening, dark clouds gathered over Meadowbrook, bringing torrential rain and howling winds. The storm was unlike anything the town had seen in decades, flooding streets and knocking out power. By morning, Meadowbrook was in chaos. Roads were impassable, and homes lay in ruins. As Lucas stood outside the clinic, surveying the devastation, Abigail joined him. "The town's going to need help," she said softly. Lucas nodded, determination hardening his features. "Then we'll give it to them." The storm, however, was only the beginning. What lay ahead would challenge Lucas in ways he had never imagined, and force Meadowbrook to confront its deepest prejudices. The reckoning. The storm that had torn through Meadowbrook was not merely a passing calamity. It was a force that uprooted lives, leaving behind a fragile community struggling to recover. Roads were washed out, bridges collapsed, and many homes were submerged in the muddy remnants of the overflowing river. The town, which had clung so tightly to its routine and traditions, now found itself in chaos. Lucas stood at the entrance of his clinic, the morning sun revealing the extent of the destruction. The muddy streets were littered with debris, broken fences, shattered windows, and overturned cars. His clinic had been spared the worst, thanks to the precautions he and Abigail had taken, but he knew others had not been so fortunate. "We need to do something," Lucas said, turning to his mother. Abigail, who had been surveying the damage with equal concern, nodded firmly. "You're the only doctor in town, Lucas," she said. "They'll have no choice but to come to you now." Lucas wasn't so sure. The town's resistance to him had been unwavering for years, and even in the face of a disaster, he doubted their attitudes would change overnight. But as he gazed at the broken town, he resolved that their prejudice would not stop him from helping. By midday, the first knock came. It was Mr. Collins, the elderly farmer who had avoided Lucas's clinic since the day it opened. His face was pale, and he clutched his chest, struggling to speak. "Dr. Whitmore," he wheezed, barely able to stand. "I think it's my heart." Lucas didn't hesitate. He guided the man inside, quickly assessing his condition. Abigail followed, fetching supplies and setting up a makeshift triage area. Lucas worked with precision, administering medication to stabilize Mr. Collins and monitoring his vitals. "Thank you," Mr. Collins murmured weakly as he was laid down to rest on a cot. "I didn't think you'd help me. After everything." Lucas met the man's gaze, his voice steady but kind. "It doesn't matter what's happened before, Mr. Collins. My job is to help, and that's what I'll do." Word of Lucas's care spread quickly. By the end of the day, more townspeople had arrived, many of them too desperate to let their biases keep them away. Families brought children with high fevers, elderly residents with injuries sustained during the storm, and people suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. The clinic, which had been eerily quiet for months, now buzzed with activity. Despite the rush, Lucas remained calm, his training guiding him through each case. Abigail worked tirelessly by his side, organizing supplies, comforting patients, and ensuring the clinic ran smoothly. "You're doing great, sweetheart," Abigail said during a rare quiet moment, handing Lucas a cup of water. "I don't think they've ever seen anyone work as hard as you." Lucas managed a tired smile. "Let's hope it makes a difference." As the days passed, the challenges multiplied. The storm had contaminated the town's water supply, leading to an outbreak of illness. Lucas recognized the symptoms immediately: high fevers, severe stomach cramps, and dehydration. It was dysentery, likely caused by the floodwaters mixing with sewage. The realization sent a chill down his spine. Without proper treatment, it could spread rapidly and become deadly. "We need to contain this," Lucas told Abigail as he prepared to address the growing crowd outside the clinic. "If we don't act fast, more people will get sick." Abigail nodded, her expression serious. "What do you need?" "Volunteers," Lucas replied. "People to distribute clean water, boil supplies, and teach hygiene practices. I can't do this alone." The next morning, Lucas stood on the clinic steps, addressing the assembled townsfolk. Their faces were etched with worry, and many still looked at him with a mix of suspicion and desperation. But Lucas's voice was steady as he explained the situation. "The water is contaminated," he said, holding up a sample of the murky liquid. "We need to boil it before drinking, cooking, or even washing. If we work together, we can stop this outbreak from getting worse." There was a murmur of unease in the crowd, but a few people stepped forward. Among them was Annie, the young girl who had once tested Lucas's science project at the fair. "I'll help," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me what to do." Slowly, others followed her lead. Even Tommy, who had bullied Lucas relentlessly as a child, volunteered to distribute clean water to those who couldn't leave their homes. Lucas worked around the clock, treating patients and training volunteers. The clinic became a hub of activity, with Abigail coordinating efforts and ensuring supplies were distributed efficiently. Lucas's calm demeanor and unwavering dedication began to shift perceptions. People who had once dismissed him now looked to him for guidance, their gratitude evident in their tired but hopeful faces. But the strain of the situation was undeniable. One evening, as Lucas sat reviewing patient charts, Abigail placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need to rest, Lucas," she said gently. "You can't help anyone if you collapse." Lucas shook his head. "I can't stop now, Mom. Too many people are counting on me." Abigail's eyes filled with both pride and worry. "You've already done more than anyone else in this town. Just don't forget to take care of yourself." The turning point came a week later when a young boy named Sam was brought to the clinic. He was barely conscious, his tiny body ravaged by dehydration. His mother, Mrs. Peterson, one of Lucas's harshest critics, was in tears as she begged for help. "Please, Dr. Whitmore," she sobbed. "He's all I have. I'll do anything." Lucas's heart ached at the sight of the child, but he didn't hesitate. He worked through the night, administering fluids and monitoring Sam's condition closely. By morning, the boy's fever had broken, and he was sitting up, weak but smiling. Mrs. Peterson clasped Lucas's hands, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was wrong about you. We all were." As the outbreak began to subside, the town slowly started to heal. The clinic remained busy, but the mood had shifted. People no longer avoided Lucas or whispered behind his back. Instead, they greeted him with smiles and gratitude, their prejudices eroded by his unwavering dedication. One evening, as Lucas and Abigail sat on the clinic steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lucas let out a deep sigh. "Do you think they'll ever really accept us, Mom?" he asked quietly. Abigail smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "They already have, Lucas. You've shown them who you are, and they can't deny it anymore." Lucas nodded, the weight of years of rejection lifting slightly from his shoulders. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, he felt like Meadowbrook was starting to see him, not just as a doctor, but as one of their own. The storm had tested them all, but it had also brought a reckoning. And in the end, it was Lucas's strength, compassion, and resilience that had shown the town what true courage looked like. A community awakens. The weeks following the storm brought a tentative sense of normalcy to Meadowbrook. The town, battered but not broken, began to rebuild. Neighbors who had once been strangers to each other now worked side by side, clearing debris, repairing homes, and sharing supplies. In the midst of this collective recovery, Lucas's clinic became the heart of the community, a hub for both healing and hope. For the first time, Lucas felt a shift in the way people regarded him. The wary glances and hesitant greetings were replaced by nods of acknowledgement, and even smiles. Abigail noticed it too, though she knew better than to believe that decades of prejudice could be undone so easily. One step at a time, she reminded Lucas one morning as they prepared for another busy day at the clinic. Lucas nodded, but he couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The storm and the subsequent outbreak had tested his limits, but it had also solidified his role in the town. He was no longer the boy they whispered about or the outsider they avoided. He was Dr. Whitmore, the man who had stayed when others might have left. One afternoon, as Lucas examined a patient, the clinic door swung open with an urgency that caught his attention. Mrs. Henderson, the town's most vocal gossip, rushed in, clutching her husband's arm. Mr. Henderson, usually a robust and jovial man, was pale and struggling to breathe. "Please, Dr. Whitmore," Mrs. Henderson pleaded, her usual haughty demeanor replaced with desperation. "He's been like this since last night. I didn't know what to do." Lucas immediately sprang into action, guiding Mr. Henderson to an exam room. Abigail, ever the steady presence, brought over the necessary equipment. Lucas's calm, measured instructions to her belied the quick calculations running through his mind. "It's pneumonia," Lucas concluded after a thorough examination. "The storm likely made things worse. We'll need to start treatment immediately." Mrs. Henderson hovered anxiously as Lucas set up an IV and administered antibiotics. For hours, Lucas monitored Mr. Henderson, checking his vitals and adjusting the treatment as needed. When Mr. Henderson's breathing finally stabilized, Mrs. Henderson burst into tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, clutching Lucas's hand. "I'm sorry for how I've treated you all these years. You saved him. You saved us." Lucas offered her a small, weary smile. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Henderson. It's my job." Word of Mr. Henderson's recovery spread quickly, and with it, the town's growing respect for Lucas. People began to see him not just as a doctor, but as someone who had chosen to stand by them in their darkest hour. Even those who had been the most resistant to change found themselves reevaluating their opinions. Tommy, who had grown into a sullen teenager, was one of them. One evening, he showed up at the clinic, awkwardly holding a basket of apples. "These are for my mom," he said, shuffling his feet. She said to thank you for helping my dad." Lucas accepted the basket with a nod. "How's your dad doing?" Tommy shrugged, his bravado slipping. "Better. He says you're the real deal." Lucas couldn't help but smile. "Tell him to keep resting. Pneumonia takes time to recover from." Tommy lingered for a moment, then blurted out, "I'm sorry for how I treated you. Back then, I was just a kid, but it wasn't right." Lucas placed a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Thank you." As the weeks turned into months, Lucas's clinic became busier than ever. People who had once avoided him now trusted him with their health and their secrets. Abigail watched with pride as Lucas handled each case with professionalism and compassion, his calm demeanor a beacon of stability. But not everyone was ready to embrace the change. Mr. Davies, the town's most vocal critic of Lucas, remained stubbornly aloof. He refused to set foot in the clinic, even as his health visibly declined. It wasn't until one fateful night that Mr. Davies's stance finally cracked. Abigail and Lucas were just locking up the clinic when a frantic knock sounded at the door. They opened it to find Mrs. Davies, her face pale and tear-streaked. "It's my husband," she cried. "He's collapsed. Please, Dr. Whitmore, you're the only one who can help." Lucas didn't hesitate. Grabbing his medical bag, he followed Mrs. Davies to their home. Mr. Davies was lying on the living room floor, gasping for air. His face was ashen, and his pulse was weak. "It's a heart attack," Lucas said grimly, immediately administering first aid. He worked with precision, his years of training guiding him through the life-or-death situation. As he stabilized Mr. Davies, the older man's eyes fluttered open. "Dr. Whitmore," he murmured weakly. I didn't think you'd come." Lucas met his gaze, his voice steady. "You're my patient, Mr. Davies. That's all that matters." The following morning, after Mr. Davies had been transferred to a hospital in the city, Mrs. Davies returned to the clinic. She held Lucas's hands tightly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've given us another chance," she said. "Thank you." Lucas simply nodded, his focus already shifting to the next patient, but Abigail could see the subtle change in her son. The years of rejection and prejudice had not broken him. They had forged him into someone stronger, someone who could rise above even the deepest wounds. As the town continued to rebuild, Lucas became more than just a doctor. He became a symbol of what Meadowbrook could become if it chose to let go of its old ways. Slowly but surely, the community began to change. Neighbors helped each other more readily, conversations grew warmer, and the lines that had once divided them blurred. One evening, the town held a gathering in the newly restored community hall. The mayor, a middle-aged woman who had always been supportive of Lucas, stepped onto the stage and cleared her throat. "This town has faced a lot in the past year," she began, her voice steady. "But we've come through it stronger. And much of that is thanks to someone who showed us what it truly means to care for one another." She turned to Lucas, who was sitting near the back with Abigail. "Dr. Whitmore, would you join me up here?" The room erupted into applause as Lucas walked to the stage, his face a mix of surprise and humility. The mayor handed him a plaque, engraved with the words, "For your service, your courage, and your unwavering dedication to the people of Meadowbrook." Lucas held the plaque in his hands, his heart swelling with emotion. As he looked out at the crowd, at the faces that had once turned away from him, he realized that Meadowbrook had finally seen him for who he truly was. And for the first time in his life, Lucas felt at home, breaking barriers. The applause in the hall echoed long after the ceremony ended, and Lucas sat quietly in the chair on stage, still holding the plaque. Abigail, beaming with pride, stood and clapped the loudest, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For years, she had carried the weight of being an outsider in a town that resisted change, and now, seeing Lucas finally recognized, her heart swelled with joy. As the crowd dispersed, many townsfolk approached Lucas to shake his hand or offer words of gratitude. Mrs. Peterson, the mother of the boy Lucas had saved from dehydration, was among the first. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling, "I owe you my son's life. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Lucas smiled kindly. "You already have. Seeing him healthy and happy is enough." Even Mr. Davies, who had recently returned home from the hospital, shuffled up with the help of his wife. His face, still pale from his ordeal, held a mixture of shame and sincerity. "Dr. Whitmore," he began, clearing his throat awkwardly, I don't deserve your kindness, but I want to thank you. You saved my life, and I see now that I was wrong about you, about everything." Lucas nodded, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that, Mr. Davies. What matters now is moving forward." Over the following months, the town's relationship with Lucas continued to evolve. The clinic remained busy, and Lucas found himself not only treating illnesses, but also addressing deeper issues within the community. Meadowbrook's struggles with division and prejudice were far from over, but Lucas had become a unifying force, showing the town what it meant to rise above fear and ignorance. One day, Lucas decided to expand the clinic's services. He proposed free health seminars and workshops, focusing on prevention and basic first aid. Abigail immediately threw herself into organizing the events, her sharp organizational skills transforming Lucas's vision into a reality. Their first seminar, held in the town hall, drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Lucas stood at the front of the room, explaining the importance of clean water and hygiene in preventing illness. As he spoke, he noticed the audience listening intently, many nodding along. After the seminar, a young girl approached him with a notebook in hand. "Dr. Whitmore," she said shyly, "I want to be a doctor like you someday. Will you teach me?" Lucas's heart swelled. He knelt to her level and smiled. "Of course. You can visit the clinic anytime, and I'll teach you everything I know." Lucas's influence began to ripple beyond the clinic. Inspired by his resilience, others in the town started to speak out against long-held prejudices. At school, teachers introduced lessons about empathy and inclusion, and the local church began hosting discussions about unity and acceptance. Abigail, ever perceptive, noticed the change. "You're doing more than healing bodies, Lucas," she said one evening as they sat on the porch. "You're healing hearts." Lucas looked out at the quiet streets of Meadowbrook, the town that had once seemed so hostile and unwelcoming. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You've always believed in me, even when no one else did." Abigail placed a hand on his. "And I always will, but now it's not just me. The town believes in you too." One day, Lucas received a letter from the state medical board inviting him to join a council on rural health care. They had heard about his work in Meadowbrook and wanted him to help develop programs for underserved communities. It was a prestigious opportunity, one that could elevate his career to new heights. When Lucas shared the news with Abigail, her reaction was immediate. "You have to accept it, Lucas. This is your chance to make an even bigger impact." But Lucas hesitated. "If I join the council, I'll have to travel a lot. I don't want to leave the clinic, or you." Abigail smiled gently. "Lucas, you've already given this town so much. Now you have the chance to help even more people. We'll manage here, I promise." After much thought, Lucas accepted the offer. He began traveling to other small towns, sharing his experiences and advocating for better healthcare resources in rural areas. Each time he returned to Meadowbrook, he was greeted with warmth and gratitude, a far cry from the days when people avoided him. As the years passed, Lucas's influence continued to grow. Meadowbrook thrived under his care and leadership, becoming a model of resilience and unity. The clinic expanded, hiring additional staff and offering new services. Lucas's young protege, the girl who had attended his first seminar, grew up to become a nurse, working alongside him in the very clinic where her dreams had taken root. For Lucas, the journey had been far from easy, but as he looked out at the bustling streets of Meadowbrook, now filled with laughter, kindness, and a sense of community, he knew it had been worth every struggle. Abigail, now older but as vibrant as ever, often reminded him of how far they had come. "This town didn't just change you, Lucas," she said one evening. "You changed it, and you did it with grace, compassion, and a heart that never gave up." Lucas squeezed her hand, his voice filled with quiet determination. "And I'll keep doing it, Mom. For you, for this town, and for everyone who needs a second chance." The storm that had once nearly destroyed Meadowbrook had become the catalyst for its transformation. And at the heart of that transformation was Lucas Whitmore, a man who had turned rejection into redemption and shown an entire community the power of love, resilience, and hope. The ripple effect. Years after the storm that had shattered Meadowbrook, the town was almost unrecognizable, not in its appearance, but in its spirit. Once divided by prejudice and fear, Meadowbrook had slowly evolved into a community that embraced compassion and progress. Lucas's clinic had played a pivotal role in that transformation, becoming a symbol of hope and healing. But the journey was far from over, and Lucas found himself facing new challenges that would test his resolve and expand his vision. It began with a letter. One brisk autumn morning, as Lucas sipped his coffee and reviewed patient charts in his modest office, Abigail entered with an envelope in hand. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and pride. "This came for you," she said, setting it on his desk. "It's from the Regional Health Department." Lucas opened the envelope carefully, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. The letter was an invitation to lead a new initiative aimed at improving healthcare access in rural areas. The program would require him to travel across the state, training other doctors and advocating for policies to address disparities in medical care. "They want me to share what we've done here," Lucas said, looking up at Abigail, "to help other towns like Meadowbrook." Abigail's smile was immediate. "Lucas, that's incredible. This is exactly what you've worked so hard for." But Lucas hesitated. "It's an honor, but what about the clinic? The town? They still need me here." Abigail placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've built something bigger than yourself, Lucas. This clinic, this town, they'll keep thriving because of what you've taught us, and you'll be helping so many more people by taking this opportunity." Over the next few weeks, Lucas wrestled with the decision. He spent his days running the clinic as usual, treating everything from seasonal colds to chronic conditions. The waiting room was always full, a testament to the trust he had earned. But at night, when the clinic was quiet and Abigail had gone to bed, Lucas would sit alone, pondering his next move. One evening, as he locked up the clinic, he saw Annie, the young girl he had inspired years ago, now a nurse, organizing supplies in the back room. "Annie," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "how would you feel about taking on more responsibility here?" She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "You mean running things if you're not around?" Lucas nodded. "I've been offered a position that would take me away from Meadowbrook sometimes, but I want to make sure the clinic is in good hands." Annie's face lit up with determination. "I'd be honored, Dr. Whitmore. You've taught me so much. I'll do whatever it takes to keep the clinic running smoothly." Her confidence reassured Lucas. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might mean to step beyond Meadowbrook's borders. The decision, when it came, felt both monumental and inevitable. Lucas accepted the position, promising to split his time between the new initiative and his work at the clinic. The announcement was met with mixed emotions in Meadowbrook. Many residents were proud of Lucas's achievement, but others worried about losing the man who had become their lifeline. At a town meeting held in the community center, Lucas addressed their concerns. "I'm not leaving Meadowbrook," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This town is my home, and this clinic is my heart. But the work we've done here can help so many others, and I promise, no matter where I go, I'll always come back." The room erupted into applause, a clear sign that the town supported him, even if it was bittersweet. Lucas's new role took him to places he had only read about, small towns nestled in valleys, farming communities spread across rolling plains, and villages so remote they lacked basic medical facilities. In each place, Lucas saw a reflection of Meadowbrook as it had once been, struggling, divided, and in need of hope. He shared his story with local leaders, doctors, and residents, using Meadowbrook as a blueprint for change. He spoke about the importance of resilience, the power of community, and the need for compassion in healthcare. "What we've learned," Lucas often said, "is that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about connection. It's about seeing people for who they are, not where they come from or what they look like." His words resonated deeply, and over time, the initiative began to bear fruit. New clinics were established, resources were redistributed, and healthcare in rural areas improved. Lucas became a respected voice in his field, his work featured in medical journals and news outlets. But despite the recognition, Lucas remained humble. Each time he returned to Meadowbrook, he was reminded of why he had started this journey. The familiar faces, the warm greetings, and the unwavering support of his mother kept him grounded. One evening, as Lucas and Abigail sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a knowing smile. "You've done so much, Lucas, for this town, for others like it, but I have a feeling you're just getting started." Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "You always seem to know what's next for me before I do." Abigail's expression grew serious. "I've always believed in you, Lucas, even when no one else did. And now the whole world is starting to see what I've known all along. You're meant to make a difference." Lucas looked out at the horizon, the fading light casting long shadows over the town he had come to love. "I just want to keep helping," he said quietly, "for as long as I can." Abigail nodded, her eyes glistening with pride. "And you will, sweetheart. You already have." The ripple effect of Lucas's work continued to spread. Meadowbrook became a model town, visited by leaders and journalists eager to understand how a once divided community had transformed itself. The clinic expanded, offering new services and attracting talented staff inspired by Lucas's story. Annie, now fully managing the clinic in Lucas's absence, flourished in her role. She often marveled at how much she had learned from Lucas, crediting him with giving her the confidence to follow her dreams. Dr. Whitmore always said that kindness and determination could change the world. She told a group of students during a health workshop, and he's proof that it's true. One day, Lucas received a call from a national organization recognizing his contributions to rural healthcare. They wanted to honor him at a prestigious ceremony in the state capitol, presenting him with an award for his groundbreaking work. When Lucas shared the news with Abigail, she beamed with pride. "You're changing lives, Lucas," she said. "But don't forget, you've already changed mine." Lucas hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by her unwavering love and support. "I wouldn't be here without you, Mom. Everything I've done is because of you." As he prepared to accept the award, Lucas reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the little boy who had faced rejection at every turn to the man who had built a legacy of healing, Lucas knew that his story wasn't just his own. It was a story of resilience, of love, and of a community that had found its way back to hope. And as he stood before the crowd to accept the award, Lucas thought of Meadowbrook, the town that had once laughed at him, but now stood as a testament to what was possible when people chose courage over fear, compassion over prejudice, and love over hate. A legacy of hope. The night of the ceremony was grander than anything Lucas had ever imagined. The venue, a towering auditorium in the state capitol, was filled with prominent leaders, healthcare professionals, and advocates from across the country. Lucas sat quietly at a table near the stage, his mother beside him. Abigail's eyes sparkled with pride, and she clutched his hand tightly, as if grounding him in the moment. "You've come so far," she whispered, "and this is just the beginning." Lucas smiled, but his mind drifted back to Meadowbrook, the small town that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The mayor's introduction pulled him back to the present. "Tonight, we honor a man whose journey embodies resilience, compassion, and the power of transformation," the mayor said, her voice echoing through the hall. Dr. Lucas Whitmore has not only revolutionized rural healthcare, but has also shown us that one person's determination can change the world. As Lucas walked to the stage, applause filled the room. The lights felt hot on his skin, and his heart raced as he accepted the plaque, a symbol of the recognition he had once thought impossible. When the applause subsided, Lucas stepped to the microphone, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I stand here tonight," he began, his voice steady but soft, "because of a small town called Meadowbrook. It's a place that taught me about struggle, rejection, and pain, but also about resilience, community, and hope." He paused, scanning the room, his thoughts drifting to Abigail and all she had sacrificed for him. "When I was a child, my mother told me that love is the most powerful force in the world. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but as I've walked this journey, I've seen how love for our neighbors, our communities, and our shared humanity, can break down barriers and build bridges." Lucas shared stories of Meadowbrook's transformation, of how the clinic became a lifeline for the town during its darkest hours. He spoke of Abigail's unwavering support and the countless patients who had taught him the value of perseverance. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he concluded. "It happens one act of kindness, one moment of courage at a time. And if my story teaches anything, I hope it's this. No matter where you come from or what challenges you face, you have the power to make a difference." The audience rose to their feet, the applause thunderous. Lucas stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the moment. But as he looked into the crowd, it wasn't the faces of strangers he saw. It was the people of Meadowbrook, the town that had once shunned him but had become his greatest inspiration. The return to Meadowbrook after the ceremony felt like coming home in the truest sense. Word of Lucas's recognition had spread, and the entire town turned out to celebrate him. Banners hung from the lampposts, and the community center buzzed with excitement as neighbors gathered for a reception in his honor. As Lucas entered the hall, he was met with cheers and handshakes. Children he had treated hugged him, parents thanked him, and elders nodded approvingly. The once divided town now stood united in their pride for the man they had come to see as their own. Mrs. Henderson, holding a tray of cupcakes, approached him with a wide smile. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling, "I've lived in Meadowbrook my whole life, and I've never been prouder to call it home. You've shown us what it means to truly care for each other." Lucas accepted her words with humility, his heart full. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, but this isn't just about me. This is about all of us." Over the next year, Lucas's work continued to expand. The Meadowbrook Health Clinic became a model for rural healthcare, drawing visitors from other towns eager to learn from its success. Lucas implemented mentorship programs, bringing in young medical professionals to train under him and his team. Annie, who had grown into her role as clinic manager, began teaching workshops on leadership and patient care. One day, Lucas found himself sitting across from a young doctor named Jeremy, who had just completed his residency and was considering joining the clinic. The conversation reminded Lucas of his own beginnings, his fears, his hopes, and his determination to make a difference. "Why Meadowbrook?" Lucas asked, leaning forward. Jeremy smiled nervously. "Because I've heard about what you've done here, Dr. Whitmore. It's inspiring. I want to be part of something that matters." Lucas nodded, seeing a reflection of his younger self in the eager doctor. "Then welcome to the team." As the clinic thrived, so did the town. Businesses reopened, the school expanded, and Meadowbrook began hosting annual community events that brought people together in ways they never had before. Lucas often walked through the town square, greeted by smiles and waves, the memories of his difficult childhood now a distant echo. But through it all, his bond with Abigail remained his anchor. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Abigail turned to him with a contemplative look. "You've built something incredible here," she said, "but have you thought about what's next?" Lucas tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" Abigail's gaze softened. "You've spent your life helping others, Lucas. But don't forget to live your own life too. You deserve happiness, not just purpose." The words stayed with him, planting a seed he couldn't ignore. For so long, Lucas had focused on his work, driven by a need to prove himself and honor his mother's sacrifices. But now, with Meadowbrook thriving, he wondered what it might mean to carve out space for himself, for love, for family, for a future beyond his work. A year later, at a town hall meeting, Lucas announced a new initiative. He would be expanding the clinic to include a wellness center, offering mental health support, family counseling, and programs for community building. The announcement was met with applause, and Abigail, sitting in the front row, smiled knowingly. "You're always thinking ahead," she teased as they walked home that night. Lucas laughed, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "I guess I learned from the best." As Meadowbrook continued to flourish, Lucas's name became synonymous with resilience and compassion. But for Lucas, the greatest reward wasn't the awards or the recognition. It was the knowledge that he had built something lasting. The boy who had once been laughed at and rejected was now the cornerstone of a community that had learned to see beyond its fears. On the clinic's 10th anniversary, a plaque was installed in the town square. It read, "In honor of Dr. Lucas Whitmore, whose vision, courage, and heart reminded us all that true strength lies in kindness and unity." As Lucas stood before the plaque, surrounded by Abigail, his team, and the people of Meadowbrook, he felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been filled with trials and triumphs, but it had led him to this moment, a moment where he was no longer just a doctor or an outsider. He was home, and his legacy was just beginning.